Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program today entitled the OMB Super Circular, What the New Rules Mean for Nonprofit Recipients of Federal Awards. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, Chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice here at the Venable Law Firm. We have what may be a record crowd here. Clearly either some very exciting and compelling speakers, a very exciting and compelling topic, or some combination of that and other factors. But we're really glad. We've got about 120 people here in the room in D.C. and close to 300 signed up and participating by webinar across the country today. So we're pleased that you could join us for our program today. As you know, or as you may know, this is part of a monthly series that we've been doing for about 3 years now on a wide variety of nonprofit legal topics that we cover every month. Always an in-person program here in our D.C. office. Those of you who can come are always free to join us for lunch. And then we do the program from 12:30 to 2 o'clock Eastern every month. Today's topic, like most of our topics, we have a lot of material to cover in a relatively short period of time, so we apologize in advance if we can't dive as deep on everything as we would like to, but we expect a really dynamic program today. Due to the size of the crowd, I'm not sure we're going to be able to take questions throughout the program like we do on some of ours, but do save up your questions for the end. We will be sure to leave a good amount of time at the end for questions. Those of you in the room, just raise your hand when you have a question, and Kelly will be walking around the room with a microphone. Be sure to wait for the microphone to ask your questions so those on the phone can hear your questions. And for those on the webinar, pose your questions. You can do it at the end or throughout the program using the chat feature on the webinar software. I'll be monitoring the laptop at the front of the room, and we'll pose your questions to our speakers today. A few housekeeping items. First off, our next scheduled program next month, April 29th, is entitled, blocking the screen here, Election Year Advocacy, Maintaining Your Nonprofit's Clear Message in Cloudy Legal Seas. This is a very interesting, complicated, dynamic area of the law that involves a number of different areas of law. This is a program that's going to be focused not only on 501c6 or 501c4 organizations, which are quite a bit in the news these days, but also 501c3 organizations as well. We're an equal opportunity law firm. We always try to make sure our programs are widely applicable to the whole nonprofit universe. I know we have a great mix today of trade and professional associations, charities, advocacy groups, and a number of others. And I can assure you next month's program will be relevant and applicable to all of you. So I encourage you to join us for that. Those of you in the room here in D.C. have a booklet in front of you that has a printed copy of the PowerPoint slides as well as full bios for our speakers and some additional ancillary material, some articles that we've written on point, including the last few issues of our Federal Grant and Contract News for Nonprofit newsletter that Diz and Melanie and other colleagues in the group write. The last few months, not surprisingly, have all been devoted to the OMB Super Circular that we're going to be covering here today. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those for additional information. Those of you on the phone will be getting an email tomorrow. All of you will get an email tomorrow that contains a link to the recording of today's program, the audio recording along with the streaming PowerPoint slides, and all of the ancillary materials, including the articles. Feel free to share that with colleagues and others who you think may benefit from that. And as many of you know, all of the recordings of our monthly nonprofit legal webinars and seminars that we do are available on our website at venable.com/nonprofit/recordings. That link is on the last page of the PowerPoint presentation today. And we recently shifted the hosting of those recordings to YouTube. We have to stay current and make it fun and interesting. So all of those recordings are actually now housed on YouTube. But if you go to that link, it'll take you to that site. And we're in the process of reorganizing that to make it even more user-friendly and enable you to find webinar recordings on topics of interest. Okay. Quick introduction of our speakers. I don't want to take much time because there's a lot of material to cover in very short order. In the center here is Diz Lacaria. Diz is a partner in our government contracts group who I've had the privilege of working closely with for a number of years in connection with federal grant and contract issues for our nonprofit organization clients. We advise quite a number of nonprofits in this area. Diz heads up that effort, has done an absolutely phenomenal job. at leading his group and helping to advise so many of our clients on these very, very complicated issues. And you're definitely going to benefit from his wisdom and insight here today. To Diz's left is Melanie Topman. Melanie is an associate in the Government Contracts Group who also does extensive work with Diz and with myself and many of our nonprofit clients. Be kind to her today. It is her first in-person speaking presentation. She's done a couple webinars and it's done great. I'm sure she's going to be great today. And then to my far right is Susan Lauscher. Susan has been a senior attorney at the Nature Conservancy for the last 20 years. We are privileged to do quite a bit of work with the Nature Conservancy, including in the federal grant and contract area, so we have the pleasure of working with Sue. She's responsible for providing legal services to the Nature Conservancy's grant service network, a group of over 100 grant specialists and attorneys around the world that work with the Nature Conservancy's government funding. Her entire legal career has been in the area of government funding and nonprofits, starting with the first federal efforts to provide funding to states for child abuse and neglect services and prevention. Her knowledge of OMB Circulars stretches back to 1979 when she joined the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Appeals Board as a staff attorney. Needless to say, Susan is a great lawyer, a great person, a great friend, but she's also one of the country's foremost experts these days on the OMB Super Circular, particularly as it applies to nonprofits. So we were very fortunate that Sue was willing and able to fly in and join us for today's program. So let me just show you briefly. I'm not going to read through this. You can see it on the screen. Here's the agenda that we're going to cover today. Thankfully, our PowerPoint slides aren't as dense as they are some months. So it won't be as hard for you to read, but there is a lot of material we're going to cover. Do save up your questions. This is complicated stuff, and hopefully we can make it all understandable and relevant for you today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diz to get us started. Diz?
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast on the phone. One thing I can say for certain is that Jeff's comment about exciting and interesting, that is a record. No one has ever said that about the Super Circular, so I'm excited to be a part of it. So we'll go through this agenda today, as Jeff mentioned, but the first topic is, what is a Super Circular? And most of you probably know that, and my colleagues and I were talking about this before we got started here, is that many of these programs I've gone to over the last couple months about the Super Circular have spent half an hour to talk about everything that led up to it. I'm going to spend about 30 seconds because it is here, it is what it is, and let's deal with it. So the Super Circular, as we refer to it, is the formal name is the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements of Federal Awards. Super Circular is how we treat it. Bottom line is it's the consolidation of 8 different circulars, all of which they've put them all into the title. So now you have a title of 8 circulars all in one. But the bottom line is you have one document, which is fabulous. There are many pros and cons about it, but at the end of the day, at least we have one thing to work with. With respect to nonprofits, it consolidates A-110, A-122, and A-133, which is huge because there had been some conflicting definitions, some conflicting terms across those circulars in the past. So it has added to some consistency, some streamlining of processes, efficiencies that nonprofits can take advantage of. The circular also presented an opportunity for the government to, and it gives us an eye where the government's kind of taking the grant world, an opportunity for the government to impose a little bit more rigidity in some ways on grantees, on grant recipients. Because what we're seeing is a more contract-like environment out of the Super Circular. For those of you who play in the federal contract world, and unfortunately I do, we have volumes and volumes of federal regulations that deal with contract law. The grant world has never been that heavily regulated, but the Super Circular is probably the first major step in that direction. So that's something to keep in mind and to be mindful of as we move forward. Okay. One of the questions about the Super Circular, in my mind, that was very confusing at the outset was, when is this really effective? Because the circular actually said in the very plain English, this is effective on the day it was issued, December 26, 2013. Well, that's great. Lots of time to transition into this brand new 700-page document. Fortunately, the government has somewhat waffled on that and given you a little bit more time to get used to these things. Because agencies are going to implement, and agencies have a year to implement. As far as we know, the agencies are probably going to adopt entirely. There might be some tweaks here and there. But the agencies have a year to implement. But I think more notably than anything is that they have this comment that says non-federal entities wishing to implement entity-wide system changes to comply with the guidance after the effective date will not be penalized for doing so. I have no idea what that means. And so while it's not effective, you can't be penalized for not following it, which implies that it might be effective. But what does penalize mean? Does that mean civil and criminal? Or does that mean disallowance because what was once allowable is now unallowable, or vice versa? There's still a lot of questions, I think, about the effectiveness. The bottom line is, as I advise clients about the super circular and transitioning from the old circulars to the new ones, is you just need to keep it all in mind. Is what you're doing now in conflict with what the super circular is going to impose whenever it becomes effective? And if it is, what is the best way to mitigate that in kind of a good faith transition effort? So if auditors do come in and they ask you about this, you have a plausible, defensible position to present to them about this whole question of effectiveness. So it does leave a lot of question, but I think there are some, I guess, reasonable ways to get through that minefield.
Am I on? Within the Nature Conservancy, the question is coming up all the time. Should I be negotiating with my federal agency under the new regulations? And I'm just saying, don't go there. Just wait until it really becomes effective, because even if it goes in effect on December 26, 2014, one presumes it will be for awards made after that date. So we could be, a year out before having to really think about it. And as you said, since some of the requirements are rather onerous, I would prefer that we not hold off.
I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah, absolutely. With that, I'll turn to the next focus.
All right, the new pre-award process. See if it can work. Well, there's a lot that we're going to talk about today that's sort of bad news or murky, but the good news is that this pre-award process is very good news. So the new pre-award process that's coming out has really been focused on standardizing all of their form applications, all of the definitions, so that there's one set of definitions, one set of applications, and one set of form grants that will be issued coming out of any sort of agency that you would be working with. That's great news. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more cost effective for you in the long run. And so we really think that this is going to be an improvement for you. One of the things that we have been stressing with our clients is that you spend some time looking at the forms, looking at the applications that are coming out, and thinking about what are the standard answers that you're going to put together for every single application going forward. If you do that, then we think you're going to be able to sort of leverage all of those answers and update them for every application that you would put out. Of course, with standard definitions being applied in different situations, because the grant world covered so many different types of entities and so many different types of financial instruments, there's of course going to be the potential for a little bit of uncertainty as these things play out. But I think overall it's probably going to be more efficient and more effective for you in going through the pre-award process.
So the next topic is fixed price awards, which for me as a 30-year-old practitioner in the grants world is just a total anomaly, and I sort of can't believe it. There is no such thing as a fixed price award. There are fixed price contracts, but this is one of the big changes in the circular. And so you'll see on the slide, if you need to find the sections, these are the citations. The circular calls them grants at one point, and it sounds like a fixed price contract, except it's now a grant. It's in the grant world. So the funder provides a specific level of funding without regard to the actual costs. And the circular says it is an option in addition to a grant, a cooperative agreement, or a contract, either to be used by a federal agency or a pass-through entity. We'll talk about pass-through entities in a moment. Accountability is not based on budget. It is based on performance and results, and you'll hear a lot about performance and results today. And that's one of the movements towards contracting that the whole circular embodies, rather than effort and making efforts to achieve what you said you were going to achieve. It's now results and performance. There's some interesting wording in the super circular that I don't understand, and maybe my colleagues have some insight into it. The circular says that the amount will be negotiated using the cost principles. Okay, we know how to do that. Or other pricing information. I have no idea what that other pricing information is. At the Conservancy, just because we feel really comfortable with the old A-122 cost principles, we haven't decided this yet, but I bet we're going to try to encourage our folks if they're negotiating these fixed price awards to continue to use the A-122, what used to be the A-122 standards that are now in the super circular. And the circular says there will be no government review of actual costs. That's one of the big differences between a fixed price contract. However, then it says it can only be used if there's adequate cost or unit pricing data to assure that the federal agency will not realize a profit. Okay, so there's that front-end process, but how are they going to know if we realize the profit or not if they can't examine actual costs? I don't know. That was a rhetorical question. The circular also says that these may not be used if there is a mandatory cost sharing or match requirement, which makes sense. And it does say that at the end of the project, you're not going to be providing budget to actual information. You're going to be providing assurances that the project was completed or the level of effort expended. So money is not the object here.
One comment I would have on it is, as Sue mentioned, I mean, this really turns the grant world on its head, the idea of a fixed price grant or a fixed price award. I mean, the whole point in the contract world of fixed price is that the contractor has the risk of overruns but the benefit of efficiencies. If you can't make a profit, you have the risk of an overrun but no benefit of efficiencies. So how is this a good... In concept, it sounds great. In reality, I'm not sure how many people are going to sign up for these. And then there's the question of, will the government audit? Well, certainly the government's going to step right over that provision if it feels that you've gotten a windfall. I have no doubt the government will disregard that audit provision and say, yeah, we want to look at your actual costs because you were not entitled to have a windfall or a profit. So it'll be interesting to see how this particular aspect plays out.
Yeah, and I want to second what Diz was just saying, that I think that you need to be very, very careful if you're working with these fixed price grants, because I do think that the government would have the ability to come after an organization under a False Claims Act violation for taking a profit or for wasting funds that it didn't think you had adequately supported your cost, even though they say they're not going to check. I think the federal money always comes with strings attached to it, so just be very careful when you're dealing with these fixed price grants.
And just one final point about fixed price awards. There's a separate section on fixed price subawards, and basically you can now use them with subrecipients. However, they require prior approval from the federal awarding agency. they cannot be more than the simplified acquisition threshold, which is $150,000 now. And then it must meet all the other requirements, including no profit and that sort of thing. But there is at least the possibility for you to turn around and give federal money on a fixed price basis to your subrecipients. Okay, onward to procurement rules. This is a big area of change, and I think tightening up. We're going to highlight the differences. I know for the Nature Conservancy, it's going to cause us to have to review and revise all of our rules, standard operating procedures, handbooks, etc., on procurements with federal funding. So the citation you see at the top, of one of the sort of transparent differences, it goes on for pages now. Unlike A-110, that was maybe a page, it goes on forever. There's a lot of meat in there, and that tells you that there are a lot of changes. Greatly expanded and mostly, I think, more onerous. We'll point out one place where I think it's a change for the better. So, in no order of importance, there are significant conflict of interest provisions, and we'll talk about those generally more later. But in addition, there is a new conflict of interest requirement, excuse me, that entities with parent, affiliate, or subsidiary organizations have to have conflict of interest policies in place covering those associated organizations so that there can be no possible problem with procurements whereby there looks like something fishy going on. So I don't think we have that with conflict. I haven't even thought about it, but I think we are going to have to change our conflict of interest provisions. Secondly, it used to be in the A-110 that there was a provision saying that there had to be procurement records that were maintained, but it used to only be for procurements over the small purchase threshold. Now that's gone. The circular says procurement records must be maintained sufficiently to detail the history of procurement. In every case, you know, if we're buying $1,000 worth of fencing somewhere, we're going to have a history of procurement. I don't even want to contemplate that, but that is a change. I would assume it's a deliberate change of wording, and that's one of the things of tightening up of documentation that you'll see throughout this provision. There is a whole new provision on time and material contracts, setting out when you can use them, and how they are to be used and how they are to be calculated, etc. So if you are thinking about, as we often do, we work with consultants and contractors all the time, especially with software and computer applications that charge us time and materials. And if you're using federal funds, you're going to have to go to this provision and see if you're ticking off all the boxes. Here's a big one. It used to be an A-110, and I thought it was a big loophole, thank goodness, that when they said competition, you needed to have competition in procurements to the maximum extent practical. And we drove a bus through that, quite frankly, because we basically said that, you know, under a certain dollar amount, it wasn't practical to have to do competition. Well, those words are gone from the circular. The circular now says, basically, it prescribes 5 methods of procurement in great detail, and they're set out on this page, and I'm just going to very briefly talk about them. Procurement by micro purchase is for under $3,000 or under $2,000 if the Davis-Bacon Act is involved. In those situations, you can make a reasonable decision and move on. gee, TNC used to have that reasonable decision threshold at $25,000. Sounds like we're going to have to go down to $3,000 in most cases. The next step up is procurement by small purchase. That's currently the simplified purchasing threshold, which is $150,000, but it's not a free ride. You have to have price or rate quotes. So anything between $3,000 and $150,000, you have to have price or rate quotes. Procurement by sealed bids, what the circular says about that is that it's going to be used for fixed price contracts. They recommend it for construction, and it's when you publicly solicit bids. And then sort of parallel to that is procurement by competitive proposal. And what they say is when it's not appropriate to use procurement by sealed bids, then you use procurement by competitive proposal, and that's you need offers, and you can use a cost reimbursement or fixed price contract. And then finally, thank goodness, they have a section on procurement by non-competitive proposal, which is, sole source contracting, which we do a lot of at the Conservancy, I think appropriately. And there's a whole section about when you can use it. And it still says you need to solicit a proposal from the sole source vendor. You can't just move ahead and contract with them. You have to actually have a proposal from them. So those are the 5 mandated ways that you can now procure under the Super Circular. Next, the old circular used to say that you had to positive efforts to contract with small and minority business, women business enterprises, and labor surplus areas had to be taken whenever possible. Well, whenever possible has disappeared. It's like the competition wherever feasible has disappeared. Whenever possible has disappeared, and the circular says that you must take all necessary affirmative steps to assure that you are contracting with small and minority businesses. So I think there's another situation where there's less leeway for non-federal entities to just make reasonable decisions based on their expertise, et cetera, and jump through more hoops. Here's the one good thing that I found in those pages of procurement rules. It used to be that A-110 required a cost or price analysis in every purchase. Now it says only in excess of the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently $150,000. Hooray. So that's the one good thing that I found that actually loosens things a little bit. Here's another one that is already worrying our folks. The circular says that you must negotiate profit as a separate element of the price in all cases where it's a sole source contract or the contract is in excess of $150,000. Our program people are already worried about that. They don't know how to, first of all, they don't think that many of our contractors will be able to provide the information that we need, and they sure are worried that they're not going to know how to calculate, evaluate, and negotiate profit. But this is what the circular now says. And there's a whole section now on pre-procurement reviews and pre-procurement certifications, which already were in effect in for many agencies. It's now all written down in the procurement section of the Super Circular. So I really recommend that this is one of those sections that your procurement people, perhaps everybody in your agency who buys stuff or services, really needs to read and understand in the next year, because it's very likely you're going to have to change your processes.
One thing I will note, though, Sue, and I think that's helpful, when you compete a grant or some sort of contract that you're issuing within the grant, you aren't going to, the profit is not going to become an element of consideration then. So competition does give you sort of a safe harbor to say that yes, these prices are reasonable under the circulars, and you don't have to get into sort of the element by element breakdown of costs. So it could, in some ways, it could be a very positive thing, just to throw in a competition. It doesn't mean you have to award it to someone, that's not qualified. If the people you've been using forever, are in fact the most qualified bidders, they will emerge as the most qualified bidders, and then you have assurances that your contract will meet all of the cost requirements under the circular. So that is one positive aspect of the competition requirements.
I agree with you, Melanie, that I think for the nonprofit world, though, if I may speak for all of you, the whole idea of having to think about profit is just mind-blowing. But I absolutely agree with you.
And this is Jeff. You're right, Sue, and that is kind of a new concept for a lot of nonprofits. But as we also see, and we work with really 600 nonprofits a year, not all of which are federal grant and contract recipients, but many are, and virtually all of which are very, very sensitive to the fact that this is a business. We all have a nonprofit mission or purpose. You're furthering a charitable cause. You're furthering an industry or a profession or whatever else your cause or issue may be. But if you want to do it effectively and help the most number of people or further the industry the most, whatever the case may be, you have to do it cost efficiently, and you need to find ways to maximize profit that you can then dedicate to your nonprofit mission. And so we've seen this for years in working in this area generally, in that it's important, I think, for all of the relevant staff in nonprofits, not just the legal staff or the compliance staff or the grants and contract staff or the finance staff, however you allocate your divisions, but it's important for all of the relevant folks to understand this. And some of the most effective trainings that Diz and I have done a number of trainings with some other colleagues at various nonprofit clients on federal grant and contract compliance, like OMB A-110 and 122, and a lot of other areas. And some of the most effective ones that we've seen are ones where they bring in dozens and dozens for the large organizations of the relevant staff, because it all goes hand in hand. And that's one thing that's going to be a challenge here, is to help educate kind of a broad segment of the staff at organizations. But if you want to be able to understand these rules, avoid stepping on the landmines, but also be able to maximize profits, it's important to do.
One other observation on the change in the procurement rules is really, this goes to one of my comments earlier about this whole shift of moving this to much more of a FAR-based analysis and approach by the government. And
we need to say what that is when you say FAR.
The FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is the predominant regulation that governs government contracts. And one interesting aspect, I think, is that arguably grantees, grant recipients, are being asked to do far more with its contractors than prime contractors are being asked to do with their subs. And that's, to Sue's point, that's going to be very difficult, I think, for grant recipients to figure out, because it's not something that has really been on your radar. You have a mission, and it's not managing your contractors. Now, that's always an important aspect. Monitoring is always a key aspect. But this is really ratcheting it up. And I kind of gave Sue the unfortunate aspects of the Super Circular, and I'm going to talk about one that's actually directly related to all this monitoring, which is indirect cost rules. And actually, here's the bright light at the end of the tunnel for the Super Circular, because I think most nonprofits believe this is a very positive development with the Super Circular. As I mentioned before, the goal was efficiency and consistency and to streamline this whole grant process. That's one of the hallmark purposes of the Super Circular. And while we get bogged down in all these new requirements, on the indirect cost side, things might be getting a little bit easier. First of all, how many times have you had federal agencies disagree with the negotiating agency on what your indirect cost rate is? Well, that no longer can be the case. All federal agencies are required to acknowledge the negotiated indirect cost rate that you have negotiated with your primary agency. Now, there's exceptions to that, but these exceptions, we're assured, will be very onerous for agencies to get around. We'll see how that actually plays out.
Can you just explain what that, put that in context, where you're getting an award but there are multiple agencies involved?
Sure. So indirect cost rates are set up where all of your administrative and overhead expenses go into a pool that's not a direct cost. Well, agencies who have grant recipients who work with multiple agencies will have one agency designated as the primary agency for negotiating that indirect cost rate. Generally, it's the agency you have the largest amount of funds with. That agency has the biggest interest. You will then go through a long, laborious process of negotiating your indirect cost rates every year, and you'll have probably those sitting out there for a couple years with temporary until you get your final indirect cost rates. In the past, other agencies, let's say you worked with Department of State, they were negotiating your indirect cost rate, and then you also did work with another agency, even let's say Department of Defense. Well, Department of Defense, they really like to do things their own way. And so they don't agree with the State Department. They don't agree with how the State Department calculated your indirect cost rate. They want you to have a different indirect cost rate. And, oh yeah, it happens to be lower. Well, that puts the burden on you guys, not on the Department of Defense and not on the State Department. So now, but for this new exception, the Department of Defense would have to adhere to whatever that main agency has determined for your indirect cost rate. So that's a very good outcome. The second, I think, tremendous outcome is that by far and away the most amount of grant funds go through state and local governments. Then they go to nonprofits and other subrecipients. And in the past, state and local governments could make a blanket decision. We're not going to provide indirect costs. You're just going to have to suck it up and pay it yourself. Well, that's not the case anymore. Now the Super Circular says state and locals will be required to pay indirect cost rates. That's a huge coup for the nonprofit industry because in the past that 10, 20%, whatever your indirect cost rate might have been, is now something that states will have to pay. So that's a big change.
But they don't have to accept the negotiated rate, the negotiated federal rate, correct?
Right. They have to go through. Now they can do their own negotiation, and that gets me to my next slide actually, and they have to follow the government standards as to how you go about negotiating it. Or nonprofits can elect a way around doing that whole negotiation, which could be a huge suck of resources for that nonprofit depending on how much is at stake. Small nonprofits that might have very small overhead or indirect expenses could go with what's part of the new rule, which is an automatic flat 10% indirect cost. Now, most organizations that I've ever worked with are well in excess of 10%. But it does allow organizations to have a much simpler, streamlined approach to getting at least some of those indirect costs paid by the federal or state entity. And I think, again, this is another huge coup because it will save a lot of time and energy as you elect to go with this easier process.
And may I interrupt again? This 10% automatic indirect cost rate would also apply to subrecipients, correct? So if we're awarding out, especially this is the case, outside the U.S. With perhaps not very sophisticated awardees, and getting them to negotiate a rate or have an audited rate or whatever was always a big deal. We could give them an automatic 10%.
Right.
Excellent.
It saves a lot of oversight and administrative burden, again, not only with your state and local grantor, but also your subrecipients. So this is, again, I think, one of the more positive developments of the Super Circular.
Okay, internal controls. Well, the truth is, with internal controls, this is another complete shift that the Super Circular is taking in what I would call the tone of the Super Circular. And if you're going to read any part of this wonderful piece of reading, late night reading, I would very much recommend that you look at Section 200.303 and give some thought to how your organization fits within the new Super Circular standards. So it used to be that there were certain areas of internal controls under the old OMB circulars where you had a set list of things that you would do, and then you knew that your internal controls were okay. And that was great because you would do those things and you would feel good about it. And time and effort, for example, is one thing that we'll talk about. It's a big shift, but that was sort of a way of knowing what your requirements were. Now, there's been an entire shift where they've moved away from any set requirements, and they're sort of just going to tell you to broadly comply with federal and state law for your internal controls, and to look at the Green Book that the GAO puts out and the Internal Control Integration Framework that is issued by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commissions. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're really going to have to exercise some judgment, which can be good and bad, in putting together your internal controls. It can be bad because there's no assurances that your internal controls are going to be sufficient in the same way that nice little list gave you those assurances. But it can also be a good thing if you really are able to craft internal controls that mirror your organization better. What we've been advising clients is really to just think about sort of the purpose of your internal controls. You want to think about, first of all, are you doing what you're saying you're going to do with the federal government money? Are you submitting financial records that are reliable to the government? Are you generally complying with all of these wonderful rules and regulations? I think these are the questions that you kind of have to ask yourself. So how are you spending your money? How do you track how you're spending the money? How do you know that your system for tracking works? You might want to think about how you set up a system for whenever irregularities come up. Like if something bad were to happen, if you were to realize, oh goodness, we didn't adequately we spent money on this grant, we actually should have been on, under a different grant, we've messed up. How does that information flow through your organization? Who receives the information? Who decides sort of the course of action you're going to take? These are all the sorts of things that you're going to need to think about and create written policies for. If you do that, I think you're generally going to be fine because the government, at the end of the day, our experience with auditors has been they just want to know how you know that you spent the money appropriately and that you accounted for your costs appropriately. And while there's no perfect system, and that's actually not even the legal standard, you have to come up with a system that's reasonable and that you have sort of reasonable assurances that you're going to meet the federal requirements.
Melanie, the only thing I'd add to that is, as all of you know, and any of you who have been following the news in recent months governing nonprofits and wide reports of fraud and embezzlement from nonprofits. And for those of you who might have been on our program, I think just a couple months ago that we did here on featuring the Washington Post reporter who wrote that story about all the kind of previously undisclosed fraud and embezzlement in nonprofit organizations that the Post investigative series discovered. And we held our program to talk about that and talk about all of the different ways that you can help prevent being a victim of those things in your organization. Internal controls way beyond the federal grant area have become so important these days. And the advice Melanie gave is great with respect to federal money, although I think there's even a lot more that generally in most organizations is going to need to be done. But well beyond that, it's just so critical that you have solid, good internal controls in your organization. We're dealing with an internal investigation right now for a very large federal grant recipient in D.C. With some procurement irregularities, pretty significant. Right now they're just dealing with it in-house. At some point it's going to need to be publicly disclosed. But it's a massive investigation. All could have been relatively easily avoided with better internal controls. And you do not want to be in a situation where you're a federal grant recipient and you find yourself the subject of fraud or embezzlement and risk federal debarment or other serious consequences. And frankly, you don't want to be on the front page of the Washington Post either. So it's one of those areas where it's worth your regular audit is not sufficient. They are not auditing for internal controls. You really need to have specialized expertise to make sure that you have sufficient controls in place for your organization.
And one more thing I will add. Thank you, Jeff. You reminded me to say this. One aspect of internal controls that you don't always think about, and Jeff alluded to this earlier, is really training your management level people. I mean, your internal controls are only going to be so good as the people that are implementing them are. And so I think you want to give some thought to setting up your internal controls, but then also talking to the people that you work with, particularly at a management level, of how to implement these internal controls, what you're going to do in the case of something being brought to their attention, who information should go to within your organization of some sort of fraud allegation. I mean, these are things I think you really have to, everyone in your organization needs to be on sort of the same page with.
Yeah. And to add to that, though, is also to make sure that the top management is filtering that down to all the people on the ground, because everyone touches compliance in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's someone in accounting or operations, the people who are letting contracts or approving subcontracts, those people are touching money, and the people in accounting, obviously. So it's imperative that these things, while they probably can be tailored for the people at the lower levels in terms of what their job responsibilities are, it's incumbent to really filter that down, the message down, all the way to the ground, because one of the studies show that one of the main things that lead to whistleblower allegations and claims is that they feel as though they don't have anyone to go to with an issue, or they went to someone with an issue and they don't feel as though it was taken seriously or anything was done about it. And so then they go to the authorities. Well, you much rather have that issue come internally and filter up to management so it can be handled appropriately before Department of Justice or some other authority comes knocking on your door asking a bunch of questions that you have no idea about.
And Diz, you remember from the training that we did in 2 different locations last year. One of the things that it was a nonprofit client here in town that we did some staff training for, and one of the things that popped out, a lot of things did, but one of them was that the program staff, we're not talking about the finance and the legal and the accounting, but the program staff really didn't have a good handle on subrecipient due diligence and subrecipient monitoring, yet they were the ones on the front lines of helping to select these subrecipients. And I saw a lot of eyes kind of open wide when we said the kind of things they should be doing, and a number of them came up to us afterward and said, well, we didn't know we're supposed to be doing that.
No, absolutely.
But yet they're the ones who are best able to do that and really need to be doing that. And that's what I was referring to earlier with kind of the training going from the top all the way down to the bottom.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I alluded to this earlier. A great example of sort of, again, this shift in tone is the time and effort rules. So it used to be under the old super circular, or the old circulars, that you had to provide very specific support for salaries and wages, and that support included that you had to look at the after the fact determination of actual activity for each employee, not budgeted. You looked at the total activity for each employee's for which each employee was compensated. Everything was signed by the individual employees or a responsible supervisor that had firsthand knowledge. And it was prepared at least monthly to coincide with one or more pay periods. So nice, simple, clear, easy to understand guidance. Now, the grantee must just sort of generally meet the broad objectives for allowability. Specific time and effort documentation is not required, they say. And you must just generally conform to your written policies, which means you must have them. And the written policies must be reasonable, and they must meet the standards of documentation for personnel expenses in the circular, which is at section 200.430. This section generally emphasizes everything we just talked about with internal controls. So basically, you have to just figure it out. I think if I were to be advising a client on this specific area, I think what I would say, again, is to sort of look at the old guidance and think about the things that the government is wanting. They're wanting you to verify that the information you're submitting is accurate, and they want that verification from someone that would know. You know, they're wanting you to really be able to track what each employee is working with on a given time period. I mean, I think just as a best practice, I mean, this isn't like a legal requirement, you really need to be doing all of your time information at least weekly. I think daily is probably much better. I can't remember, maybe this is because I have a 6-month-old at home, I can't remember what I did a day ago. So like, for me, when I do my time, I keep it daily and I keep it accurate, and you know, I know if there's a problem with it because I'm doing it at the same time that I'm performing, you know, the tasks. And so I think that that's really important. And then I would also say it's very important. I've had experience with this on the contract side that is now, you know, going to be applicable for all of you, to really think through if you're going to move time around or you're going to make some sort of alteration, you need to have a written policy for how you're going to do that, who's going to sign off on that, how you're going to verify that the information is accurate. Because since there is no more sort of safe harbor list of things to do, I think that this is fertile ground for a definitely False Claims Act allegation.
To talk a little more about time and effort reporting and what at least the Nature Conservancy is considering or has already considered. TNC's, we've had a time and effort system since 1994. It was originally on paper, now it's all electronic. But we followed to the letter all those wonderful requirements that Melanie set out. So everybody at the Conservancy, from the CEO to some preserve manager, filled out a timesheet, actual time worked every day, all their time. Either an employee or the supervisor who knew what the employee did. For exempt people, signed time reports, and for non-exempt, we supervisors had to sign time reports. There was no estimating except in really limited circumstances. Well, I read the circular, and being a lawyer, I thought, oh my God, this could be a disaster from an internal control point of view, because one of the big changes is that it allows for some estimating. You can use budget estimates before services are actually provided, and they can be used to charge time. However, the super circular is very clear that you need a very strong system to make sure that by the time the final amount charged to the federal award is made, that in fact you have actual time. So you'd have to construct a whole system of reviewing estimates and making changes and documenting those changes. Faced with all of that, when I talked to our HR people and gently persuaded them a certain way, we have decided not to change anything about our time reporting system. We think it will meet all the internal control requirements that are no longer specified, and will be a lot less confusing for people. And we certainly don't want to tell people that they can start charging time based on budgets, but then they have to review them and revise them. It just would be a nightmare. So that's what we have decided to do. We have decided to say to the super circular, thank you for the additional flexibility, but no thank you. Now let me talk just a tiny bit about colleges and universities, in case there are any of you folks representing colleges and universities out there. I'm no expert in this, but I did go back and read A21, which is the circular that deals with cost allowability for colleges and universities. And the current super circular looks totally different with regard to time reporting systems, and follows what Melanie was saying. Instead of really detailed rules that used to be, they used to tell you there were 3 sort of ways you could due time reporting, plan confirmation, after the fact activity reports, multiple confirmation records. That's all gone. There are just some general principles in addition to all of these principles about time reporting that are addressed to colleges and universities. One of them is that if you want to report time based on a percentage distribution of total activities, in other words, percentages, that's fine. And then there's this really, once again, really ambiguous section that says that there is a recognition, I guess by OMB, that teaching, research, service, and administration often are inextricably intermingled in an academic setting. So precise assessment of factors that contribute to costs is therefore not always feasible, nor is it expected. So I don't know where that leaves colleges and universities on their time reporting systems. But it's just totally different than the old A-21. So for those of you representing colleges and universities, you need to look at these time reporting provisions carefully.
Before we move on to the next topic, I want to kind of second Sue's comment about what TNC has, kind of their approach to time and effort changes. And just to kind of put this in perspective is that, so they took away all the clear, bright lines and gave you, this amorphous world. But think about the auditors and all the government people who have grown up with A-110. They're new to the super circular too. What do you think they're going to apply? They're going to apply A-110. So unless you're a nonprofit starting today or starting, sometime this year or next year, I wouldn't change a thing, because that's the only, I think every auditor is going to come in there and say, so how often do you record your time? Oh, really? Why do you do it that way? Why don't you do what the old circular used to say? I just think that that's going to be something that it's just best to follow the old rules. Even though they're not as clear safe harbor as they once were, it's, that's how everyone's still going to view it, in my opinion. So that's just the opinion of me. Okay, so again, I get the good news. So focusing on, partially good news, improving transparency of single award audits. Another one of the kind of bright lights for especially the smaller nonprofits out there is the change in the single audit requirements. So one of the big changes is that the threshold that used to be $500,000 has now been kicked up to $750,000. So for those smaller nonprofits that receive federal awards, if they're less than $750,000, they are now exempt from the single award audit requirement. So that is fabulous news for all those smaller nonprofits. Obviously, this will reduce in costs. The OMB predicts that somewhere north of 5,000 nonprofits will be impacted by this. They also estimate that something like 95% or more of the federal funds are still subject to audit. So I don't really think it has that big of an impact. It probably saves the government more money than it saves the nonprofits, but we'll take it. Anything we can get, we'll take. So that's obviously a positive outcome. I think on the transparency side, most of these were available somehow, some way publicly, and you could get them eventually. But now all of the audit reports are going to be on a website. Now, our government websites are somewhat lacking in their efficiencies, so it'll be curious to see how they roll that out. But they do plan to make single award audit reports available on a website. So we'll see how that plays out, because in the past, government-funded websites have their problems. Okay. More stringent integrity rules. I'll turn it to Melanie.
Okay. Again, we're seeing sort of a tone shift that's more similar to what the posture that the government's taken in the government contracting world is now kind of being imposed upon the grant world, so we're sorry. But in the past, there's always been sort of a conflict of interest requirement, or conflict of interest like policy that you probably had and you've been required to have. The new rules, I think, give those policies a lot more teeth. In first of all, you're required to report conflicts of interest in a pre-award setting. So if you're applying, for a grant, you have to list any possible conflicts of interest, and the agency is going to make an assessment of those. That's interesting because it's actually a little bit of a higher standard than government contractors are held to. So I don't know if this is like something they're trying out. What I think, if I were going to advise a client on, I would just say, the best you can do is really just to educate your team on what might be a conflict of interest, to have a policy, but really talk to your team that's putting together the application, talk to your team, sort of all of your personnel about what might be a conflict of interest so that they can raise a concern to your team and to that's putting together your application in sort of a quick way. I think you will also want to put together a plan for sort of assessing how you're going to look at a conflict of interest, and some of you probably have these plans already, but I think it's going to be even more important because you're going to want to do this quickly. For sort of someone knowing who is going to be responsible for looking at that potential conflict of interest and then deciding, do we need to inform the government of this? Is this really a conflict of interest? I think having someone in place to be that person and sort of a plan for them is going to be important. And then I think you want to develop also sort of a template mitigation plan for your people that or your entities that that you're in conflict with routinely. I think that you want to go ahead and sort of think about what are the ways that we're going to mitigate this potential conflict of interest and the way that we're going to present that to the government so that we might still get this grant award. The other big shift is you're now required to report organizational conflicts of interest. I know that's been sort of a hot area in government contracts and not such a hot area in the grant world, but welcome to the new conflicts of interest world for grants. What I think, there's no guidance for grants and what is an organizational conflict of interest. So what I would do is I would look at the Federal Acquisition Regulation rules. They're in FAR Part 9.5 and sort of look at the different types of organizational conflicts of interest that are developed in those rules. It might be helpful to you as you sort of put together a policy for your own organization.
Melanie, can you briefly tell us what the difference between an organizational conflict of interest and a regular conflict of interest is?
I think you can jump into. I think an organizational conflict of interest is, well, there's 3 different types of organizational conflicts of interest that have developed in the government contract world. Let's start there. The first is an impaired objectivity OCI. So that's where you've done some work for the government, and because of the work with the government that you've done with them, you'd be sort of evaluating yourself. I know that sounds sort of strange, but it's a small world sometimes. And so that's called an impaired objectivity OCI. There's unequal to access of information OCIs. So because, again, of your position on past grant world work, you have access to proprietary information, either information that's proprietary to the government and sensitive, you sort of know what they are looking for beyond what other people that are applying for the grant know, or information about what your competitors may be doing that you have access only because of your sort of relationship with the government and the work that you've done with them.
Interestingly on that one though, incumbency in the contract world, which in the grant world it's not apples to apples, but incumbency is not deemed unequal access to information, so keep that in mind. So again, it doesn't translate completely, but if you gained information because you were the incumbent grantee and somehow there's a follow-on grant that's going to another organization, some of that information wouldn't be unequal access because it's inherent that you're going to have access as the grant recipient. But
That's right, yeah. I mean, of course, people will argue about what is and isn't unequal access to information. And then the third is biased ground rules OCI, and that's where again, because of your relationship with the government in the past, you've in some way set the rules for the next grant, and that can be very problematic. I think that really the difference, I guess I would characterize the difference between an OCI or an organizational conflict of interest and a regular conflict of interest as a conflict of interest that's arisen because of your past work with the government. The things that you've done with the government has sort of you've either gotten information, or it's created a relationship, or it's put you in a position where you're uniquely positioned beyond just being the incumbent grantee. And I think, it may not be applicable to a lot of you, but if you're, at an organization like SUE that does a lot of repeat work for the government, this could be a problem and fertile ground for conflict.
Melanie, the only thing I'd add beyond that is that for all of you in the nonprofit world, you're probably very familiar with conflicts of interest well beyond the federal grant and contract world. So I just want to stress that the whole world and the whole issue of conflicts of interest goes well beyond what we're talking about here today. And while it's critically important that you have appropriate conflict policies and that they're properly managed and enforced within your organization for federal grant purposes, as we're talking about here today, it's equally important in other areas to have appropriate conflict policies that govern your officers, your directors, your staff, even your committee members, and sometimes other volunteers. For so many different reasons. The IRS cares about it, state attorneys general care about it, and so many other people care about it. Another kind of lesson learned in this area is that not all conflict policies are equal. They have to be tailored to the specific situations that affect your organization. They need to be tailored to your organization. The worst thing you can do is just take some off-the-shelf conflicts policy and adopt it as your own. Every organization is different. Its history in dealing with conflicts is different. Its culture is different. Its funding sources are different. How it spends its money is different. And conflict policies have an effect on all of that. Its governance structure may be different, and so the conflict policy needs to be tailored to your organization specifically, sometimes even including examples and other things like that, because a conflict policy doesn't do any good if, say, your officers and directors don't even understand half of it, and it's written in a lot of legalese, because if they don't know what a conflict is, if they're not thinking broadly enough about what a conflict is, for instance, they're not going to know how to disclose it, and you can't do something about it if you don't know about it. And then the last point I would make is that the process for how you manage conflicts is very important, because not all conflicts of interest are bad. There are many conflicts that nonprofits face that are actually very good for the organization, but you can't take advantage of that good opportunity where there's a conflict involved unless you manage it properly. And what does that mean? It means A, disclosure, but it doesn't stop with disclosure, it just starts there. And B, that you have an independent process for evaluating that conflict. So you have an independent group of decision makers who look at that situation and say, yes, despite this conflict, we believe that, for instance, hiring this board member to provide these services to our organization is in our best interest because he's got a great reputation, great history. We checked his references, they're great. We got bids from 3 other folks. They weren't nearly as strong, and he's doing it at half his normal rate for our organization. But you need to have a group of independent decision makers that make that decision in order to effectively manage those conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, to Jeff's point, not all conflict policies are the same, because what was once most organizations worried about it at the top level, financial conflicts of interest, it really has to go deeper than that. It has to go to programmatic, because programmatic people have an effect. Now, it doesn't need to be the same type, but programmatic people need to be educated on what are you doing separately from this work that might impact this work, and who do we need? We need to know internally. Do we need to know externally? Do we need to share that with the government? Because it is an area that the government is laser focus on, because the whole waste, fraud, and abuse focus, conflicts of interest is right at the heart of that.
Yeah, and one question from the webinar. I'm not sure, the question's a little bit awkwardly worded, but I think what the gentleman's asking is, are these requirements regarding internal controls, conflicts, et cetera, are these things that need to be incorporated, he's saying in state and local contracts, but I think he also means in agreements with subrecipients and things like that. To what extent do we need to nonprofit federal grant recipients need to incorporate some of these provisions into other contracts that they enter into through which they're spending these federal funds?
Yeah, I mean, I think my view, and some of it, I guess, filters out as you go lower and lower. But the bottom line is, if you're a recipient of federal funds, you are a steward of those funds. And the government is foisting these requirements on you as though you were the federal government for you to foist upon the subs. So you push it all down. Don't hold the liability in your hands. Push the liability down. It's not worth saying, well, I mean, I understand sometimes there's very small subrecipients. You don't want to put a burden on them. But at the end of the day, then the organization needs to make a conscious effort. Okay, we are going to save ABC recipient from these obligations, but we know consciously that we are now taking that liability on.
And one more note on that is you may want to give some thought to having a provision in your sub-recipient agreements that gives you access, if you don't have this already, gives you access to these types of documents and this, whether or not they're actually meeting their requirements for these conflicts of interest policies or whatever cost documentation. Because, I mean, Diz and I have worked with many a grantee that did not get access to information to its subrecipients and has really been in a heated battle with federal auditors years later.
Okay, just so we can leave a good bit of time for questions here, I'll go through the mandatory disclosure slide really quickly. This is interesting because this hit something similar to this hit the contract world about 5 years ago. It was more broad because it also relates to civil, but the Super Circular provides that organizations report, disclose all violations of criminal fraud, bribery, gratuities, et cetera, relating to the grant. This is interesting because all is pretty broad. Second of all, criminal, what the difference is between criminal fraud and civil fraud is a very murky line. And it creates, I think, a lot of question in terms of what do you need to do. Now, obviously, all of my clients would never have something like this to report, so we're clean. But all of you out there, you need to worry about this. At the end of the day, you should hopefully already take the approach of transparency with your federal funding agency, whether it's a civil issue or a criminal issue, because if it comes out and you don't control that message, you are going to be in a world of hot water. And so while this is now in there, it's no different to me on how I would have advised my clients before, but it is now a very strict requirement, and it imposes debarment sanctions, which means a total blacklist from receiving federal funding. So it certainly has very strict and serious ramifications for failing to comply. But I do want to open it up to questions before we run out of time. So let's
Diz, before we get to questions, one final question here. You've talked, both you and Melanie talked a lot about the False Claims Act, and I know you do a lot of work in that area, defending a lot of False Claims Act cases. For those who are not familiar, just take like 2 minutes just to not to explain what a false claim is, not to explain really the standard and the violation, but how do these cases typically come about, and what's the process, and any advice for avoiding that?
Sure. Okay, so briefly, and I don't have the 2013 figures, but the 2012 figures, the federal government recovered over $5 billion in FCA-related claims and settlements. $5 billion with a B. That came from contractors and grantees alike. The False Claims Act, the civil side, that's the civil, provides that a false statement submitted or a false claim, which can be any invoice, drawdown of funds, etc., submitted to the government that is not accurate can be deemed a false claim. Now, there's some safe harbors to that, but essentially there is no intent requirement, because what it requires from intent is that you knowingly did this. And knowing can mean something as simple as what they deem as reckless disregard. And that's the big area, because you didn't actually know, because that actually takes you to criminal, but you were not careful enough in how you administer your systems or your programs that it was infected and it went forward. And that can lead to a False Claims Act. And that happens. Timekeeping is a huge area, because you don't have a good enough training program. Your company is in reckless disregard of the timekeeping standards. Now the timekeeping standards have gone out the window, so it'll be interesting to see how much the government can rely on that. But that is by far and away probably the biggest area for especially for grantees in False Claims Act is mischarging time. It had serious repercussions. Treble damages of the amount claimed to the government. In the contract world, that is also moving now to strict liability in terms of the entire value of a contract. That hasn't migrated to the grant world yet, but it's something that I could foresee happening, where you're talking about treble the grant value, which would be really disastrous. And also significant suspension and debarment. About 4 years ago, a major change in suspension debarment programs caused every agency to open up an office. And whereas many offices, they were there in name only, suspension debarment now is very live and vigorous in both the contract and grant world because they're making annual reports to Congress on their numbers. And so we're seeing this move, this strong move towards really tamping down what they deem waste, fraud, and abuse. And the Super Circular explicitly says that is one of the focuses. So that's probably why Melanie and I are always focused on this, is to keep our clients hopefully in the straight and narrow.
And it's easier these days than ever before for a federal agency's inspector general to learn about alleged FCA allegations through whistleblowers, through media reports. We've seen many of our clients have investigations launched just because of media reports, and certainly because of whistleblowers, and in other ways as well, interagency referrals and other things.
And I mentioned the whistleblowers before, is making sure all your employees have avenues to report concerns and issues. Look, I entered my time in, it's not working, or I didn't know how to do it. Something as simple as I didn't know how to do my time should never lead to something as serious as an FCA, but it happens. And so it's a matter of making sure your employees know about what to do, and if they have questions, where to go with those questions, because the majority of FCA claims do come through whistleblower because there's actually an incentive. They get actually a percentage of the award.
So to put it another way, you want the whistleblowing process to occur in-house, not outside your house, so that you have an opportunity to investigate it, to take disciplinary action, and to fix the process. Because what we've seen is that the organizations that come out of federal agency investigations, we see it with IRS audits, we see it in a lot of areas, state attorney general investigations, the ones that come out the best tend to be the ones that learned about where there's some real problems and issues. They learned about the issues first. They took steps to correct the issues, to put in place proper policies and procedures to clean up the mess, and then the agency comes in. We're dealing with an organization just got an IRS audit yesterday of ours, organization sparked by press coverage. Thankfully, though, we've been able to work with this organization for months to kind of put new governance structure and policies and procedures and really overhaul the organization from top to bottom. Sure, they're not happy about the IRS auditors coming in, but they're very happy that the audit is starting now as opposed to 6 months or 12 months ago.
And Melanie made this point earlier, and it's a good thing to keep in mind, is perfection is not required. It's a matter of what do you do when there's a problem. And that's really what the government, the auditors, they're pencil pushers, and I have a strong affinity for them. But when it comes down to the Department of Justice and the suspension debarment officials, they are looking at what are you doing to better yourself, and to what did you do to prevent the issue, and what are you doing both before and after the issue. So perfection is not a requirement, but certainly being proactive and staying on top of things is.
All right, let's open it up for some questions here. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi. You did mention about the Super Circular as covering certain parts of the FAR, and I can see that on our discussion. FAR Part 15, I think, and 12, and FAR Part 9 is conflict of interest. Do you think this is more of like a stepping stone by the government to introduce other FAR parts later on? One sensitive matter, I guess, is FAR Part 27, especially for research organizations. That talks about, that deals with data rights.
I absolutely believe it's a move towards the FAR. Now, I don't think they'll ever adopt the FAR, but I think the FAR is developed over time, and I don't think they want to start from scratch writing all these regulations. So they're just saying, well, that seems to work pretty good over there, so let's just adopt it in name. And with respect, I haven't heard anything on FAR Part 27, and that would be, I imagine, would be very difficult for them to push that forward. I think the nonprofit community would vomit if that occurred, because I mean that's a lot of everything a nonprofit sometimes has, and contractors have a hard time with 27 as it is. So.
That's an official legal term, right?
And Part 27, those of you who don't know, deals with intellectual property rights, data rights, all those types of issues.
Very important in the research here.
And it's mind-boggling for those of us who are used to the very simple and continued language in A-110, and it continues in the super circular on intellectual property. The FAR provisions are mind-boggling.
Time for a next question, but real quick before we get to that, in case we lose people, I just want to point out we didn't get to cover everything here today. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of follow-up questions. Always feel free to reach out to us, but there is a wealth of information on our firm's website on these topics. So take a look at those links at the last slide of the program. Actually, Diz, if you can advance to that, and if you go to the one that says venable.com/nonprofit/publications, there's a topic area called Government Grants and Contracts, where we have all of our articles, presentations, and whatnot on these topics located there, including the monthly newsletter that we do specifically on these federal grant and contract issues. And in addition, Diz and I participated in the monthly seminar that we did about a year ago, last February, with another client from the Institute of International Education. And that was a terrific program, kind of more introductory, high level on federal grant and contract issues for nonprofits. But if you're kind of new to this world and you want to learn more about it, I'd go onto the website and or onto YouTube and listen to that program. Next question.
Hi, I'm Brad Ward with AIDS United. I'm the compliance officer. Thank you for this presentation today. It's really timely. We have an ongoing lively discussion with a particular federal agency about the treatment of rent as a direct versus an indirect cost. Any guidance to us?
I can tell you what TNC does currently. We have made a decision that all rent will be charged indirectly unless there is an office that contains only one program. And we do have a couple of those. But we just decided a quagmire to try to allocate, et cetera, and so we made it simple. Now, we are going through a whole analysis at TNC of thinking about our direct and indirect costs. I haven't heard rent being one of those things that is going to be looked at, but there's definitely a move to try to move more to direct costs. But that's what we're doing currently.
My legal response is it depends.
Russell.
So I have a question about research subcontracting, and let's talk about it in the college and university context. So on the one hand, what are the sort of competition requirements? And the other thing is sort of from a monitoring point of view, work product is hard to sort of track and in fact even audit. It's not like the number of bowls of soup you hand out in a soup kitchen, for example. And to the extent that time is required to be recorded, et cetera, it's a little bit more difficult to track that. And furthermore, where do the conflicts of interest issues come in? So let's say, for example, Professor so-and-so at Georgetown, a nonprofit, was a recent graduate of GW, a nonprofit, and has some ongoing collaboration with his or her former professor on a non-competitive basis because they already know have a working relationship, knowledgeable about each other's expertise, et cetera. Does this throw this all out the door, or the way that universities normally do collaborative research?
I don't think it throws it out the door. I think it has to be analyzed very closely, because what you're talking about is, two professors who have prior affiliation maybe with one another, but do they have the ability to act in objective context and with whatever it is they're doing? And I don't really have a sense of what they're doing with one another, but it's all about objectivity. Can a person be objective with whatever past or relationships that they have? Now, the first step in that process is, as Jeff mentioned, is disclosure, right? So they should not be the ones making that decision. They should elevate it to someone else to make that decision, someone independent of that to make that decision. And once you do that, then like Jeff said, not everything is necessarily a negative conflict of interest, or it's not even a conflict. You have another interest, but it doesn't have to be in conflict. But it's hard to opine on that fact scenario with just not enough facts.
Well, under the current procurement rules,
Everything has to be competed.
unless you're under $3,000, you're going to have to do something.
But I wasn't sure to me whether that was a contract
Right.
or a grant, a subrecipient. So I didn't.
Right.
You get a grant to do the prime awardee gets a
Right.
grant or cooperative regulator and needs some additional expertise and faculty members all collaborate. And the other person, the second collaborator, is not going to do it for free.
So are they contracting for that, or is it more of a subrecipient type relationship? Because that's where the competition requirements. Well, right, yeah, I mean every document is a contractual relationship of some sort, but there's a major distinction between a subrecipient agreement and a contract, and the competition requirements focus around a contract. So if that person is providing services to the program, it's more like a subrecipient. If he's providing goods or services, it's more like a contract. And so you'd have to really dig into what that agreement is all about.
And then furthermore, there are robust subrecipient monitoring requirements in the super circular that apply to subrecipients, not contractors. And so you'd have to if you decide that it is not a contractual relationship but a subrecipient relationship, you then have to go and look at the subrecipient monitoring parts of the super circular that require a robust system of subrecipient monitoring, which I assume most grantees have already.
You don't necessarily make that assumption. We have a question from the webinar. At what contract dollar threshold must a prime recipient verify that their subrecipient has not been suspended or disbarred?
Generally, it's a $30,000 requirement. I don't recall it changing.
I thought it was all. I mean, we check all.
We check all, but it's generally a $30,000, but that's at the contract level, not at the subrecipient level. So,
okay. Anita?
We were back here wanting to confirm that if you are the grantee and you have a subrecipient, the subrecipient is still subject to all the procurement requirements?
Sue, I'll let you take that one.
That when the subrecipient goes further and procures?
Yes. Are they subject to the same
I would say yes, because it's federal money and it flows down.
Right.
Would you agree?
I would agree.
That little entity that's sitting in Brazil.
Just for everyone else's, Anita actually works with Sue at TNC. But again, this is one of those things that I mentioned earlier about the liability. It's always best to try to push it all down. There are business reasons that you might not, because it's a little dinky mom and pop organization and they really can't handle that burden. But just know that you're now taking that liability on.
Question right here. Sorry, question right here. And this is going to be our final question.
There are other granting organizations besides the federal government, foundations, for example, and they are themselves often 501c3s, but some of their contracting and granting and financial relationships with the entities they fund are different than the requirements that I've heard described in the federal circular. Are they now subject to these same requirements, or do those of us who are recipients of grants from foundations having to maintain two separate systems, two separate ways of calculating indirects? What's your thought?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the first answer to that is that it depends on where their money is coming from. Just the prior answer that we just gave is going to answer that in part. Is that if this foundation is getting federal funds and they're then flowing them down to you and you're the subrecipient, then they should be flowing down those federal requirements, and you're going to be subject to those, and they should tell you in your contract, and I'm using the term contract like in a written agreement as opposed to federal contract, they should be telling you in your agreement that you have to do that. If their money is not coming from the federal government, it could be coming from a state government that has similar requirements, but just say it's just private contributions from individuals, from corporations, or other money that they otherwise raised, which is probably most of the money that foundations give out. In that case, they're not going to be subject to these federal requirements, but they may have their own requirements that they impose on you. Typically, private foundations are going to have even more stringent requirements that they're going to impose on you because they're subject to stricter requirements by the IRS than, say, a public charity. But either way, whatever they're telling you you have to do, you have to do. And then you need to figure out how to merge all this because what you're looking for ultimately is a lowest common denominator, a system where you don't have two separate sets of timesheets and you don't have, you might have different indirect cost methods and percentages and things like that. That's common, but at least you want to have the basic processes and systems for your staff to be the same. Otherwise, it could be an administrative nightmare. But you have to do it in a way that complies with all of those requirements. And I'm glad you said that because it's actually a point I was going to raise earlier, that while all of the stuff we talked about here today is only applicable when federal money is involved, it may not be a bad idea and may become a best practice for nonprofits to more generally adopt at least some of these principles into their own systems and structures, to be a better steward of the money. So even when you're giving your own money away to another organization, not federal money, adopting some of these subrecipient monitoring and reporting and due diligence requirements is probably not a bad idea.
Can the feds who are looking at this question say to the entity that the stricter requirements that, in this case, a foundation or other grantor are applying have to be
So your question is, would say a federal agency inspector general come in and say, well, why weren't you complying with the stricter requirements from some other foundation? I think that if we're talking about private money again, not federal money from this other foundation, then no, the feds are going to have no say-so in any of that. But if the feds are looking at that prime recipient and then they also open an investigation of you as a subrecipient, then that's a different story.
Yeah, just one caveat to that. If you take those more strict requirements of a foundation and they're somehow baked into your policies, and your policies are not clear that those more strict standards apply only to private funds and not federal funds, I have seen auditors say, well, why aren't you applying your policies to these federal? Well, they're more strict than the federal, but those are your company policies, and you're supposed to follow your company policies. So if you have more strict requirements because of private funds, that's fine, and they don't generally bleed into the federal, but make certain it says relate to private funds so no one has any confusion that those should apply also to the federal funds.
Yeah, that's a great point, Diz. One point of clarification, if you look on the slide where it says at the bottom, click here, that takes you directly to that nonprofit YouTube channel that we have. But if you want the simple link to find it, just go to venable.com/nonprofit/recordings, and that'll take you to that. I want to thank Sue and Diz and Melanie for a terrific job today helping to make intelligible some very difficult, complicated stuff. I thought they did a terrific job. Thank you all for participating. We hope to see you back next month. Thank you.